What's going on, everybody? Josh Engleman for Awesemo.com, and I am back with my NFL top fives, my top five quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends for week 12 and this 12-game slate, or what looks like a 12-game slate, depending on what happens with Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Now hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all of our other content goes live. Follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman so you can get updates to these sim results as we get closer to lock. And finally, let me know in the comments section, who are your favorite quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end plays for the main slate on Sunday? We're going to kick it off with the tight ends, Jonnu Smith, Evan Ingram, Mike Gesicki, Hayden Hurst, and Hunter Henry. That's a lot of H's. They are all on the outside looking in. It's time to find out who the top 5 tight ends are. Coming in number 5, this one's already got a caveat. That would be Mark Andrews, $5,200, 11.8 fantasy point projection. Ravens are 4-point underdogs in Pittsburgh, going up against a very difficult Pittsburgh defense, 6th against the run, 1st against the pass. Andrews finishes as the optimal tight end about 6% of the time. You're going to see there's a tier here. Everybody exists below number 2, and then we've got 2 tight ends that are just a little bit different this week. I don't mind going to Mark Andrews, but I see most of this position as similar with 2 clear-cut options. Mark Andrews, unfortunately, not one of those options. Coming in number 4, another tight end with a really difficult matchup, 4,200, Noah Fant, projected for 10 fantasy points. In the optimal lineup, 7.5% of the time. It's a price play. But Saints D, 2nd against the run, 5th against the pass. The low total, 44-point game total, so you're not expecting a ton of scoring. And clearly, this isn't a great spot for Denver. 6-point underdogs at that. I like going to Fant. It's not a problem. He's cheap. He's not going to hurt you if you have him. But again, there are better options above him. Final option in the this is pretty much everybody tier, $3,800 Austin Hooper, 10.1 fantasy point projection, taking on the Jags. Cleveland, 6-point favorites, 49-point total. And Jacksonville is a terrible, terrible defense. 21st against the run, 30th against the pass. So we're getting close to the bottom. Hooper shows up in the optimal lineup 7.7% of the time. You're not expecting a massive day here, but if Austin Hooper gets in the end zone, you're going to be pretty happy. And given the way that scoring is set up, it's a pretty high likelihood that Austin Hooper can score a touchdown. I wouldn't mind that prop either. Keep an eye out for those betting videos that my partner in crime, Ben Razin, and I do. But for right now, Austin Hooper is 3, and now we get into the good stuff. Coming in, number 2, $7,000. This guy's just priced like a wide receiver because he's basically a wide receiver. 18.6 fantasy point projection for Travis Kelce. This guy transcends matchups. At Tampa Bay, 3-point favorites, 55.5-point total against probably the best defense in the league. 1st against the run, 2nd against the pass. But Travis Kelce can go for north of 30 fantasy points a lot. 9.8% of the time, in fact. Now, if he goes for less than 10, which is not a trivial amount, it's going to be a problem for you at 7K, but he is in the optimal lineup 18% of the time. It's clearly going to be a fun game to stack. Plenty of options on the Kansas City side, plenty of options on the Tampa Bay side. Travis Kelce looks great, well worth a $7,000 price tag. However, there's an even better option than Travis Kelce, and it's not really that close. You can save a full $1,000 and go to my number 1. That would be Darren Waller. 17.4 fantasy point projection at Atlanta. Oakland. Ooh, they're not Oakland anymore. We're going to go with it. Las Vegas, 3-point favorites, 54-point line. 10th against the run, 26th against the pass. This spot looks great. You get that savings off of Travis Kelce. You're getting the same sort of terrible matchup. Huge game total, so you're expecting a lot of scoring. Waller shows up in the optimal almost 23% of the time. I think he is clearly the best tight end option on the slate. He's a guy that I'll have quite a bit of exposure to as we get closer to Sunday. I don't expect this to change. Darren Waller, number 1 tight end. Now we transition over to the wide receivers. Caveat number 1, Adam Thielen coming in number 10. I'm assuming he's going to be back, but we'll keep an eye on it. Devontae Parker at 9, Tyreek Hill at 8, DeAndre Hopkins at 7, Keenan Allen at 6 on the outside looking in. And now we move to number 5. And it is a little bit of a step up over that Allen, Hopkins, everybody that I just named, basically. They're all real similar projections. But Chris Godwin, 12.3% chance of finishing in the optimal lineup. He's coming in number 5, 6,000, a 15.8 fantasy point projection. On the opposite side of that Kansas City game, we're expecting a ton of scoring. The rush defense for Kansas City, not all that great. Not super helpful for Chris Godwin, but 10th ranked pass defense, that's fine. Nothing to be super worried about. There's a big bust potential for Godwin just because of the options. 18% of the time he goes for less than 10, but you can also see the days where Chris Godwin simply just breaks the slate, goes for north of 30 fantasy points 10% of the time. I'm hoping that's one of those days. I'm really liking Chris Godwin. That's why you see him at number 5. Coming in number 4, very similar play, $100 more expensive, 15.6 fantasy point projection for Robbie Anderson. They're going to be at Minnesota, 3.5 point underdogs, but still a 50-plus point game total. Slightly better defensive matchup. Minnesota 12th against the pass. And this one just feels really similar to Godwin. A very similar amount of time. They're going to be in the optimal lineup, 12.8% in this case. Robbie Anderson can go for north of 30 fantasy points, about 10% of the time. Goes for less than 10, like 18% of the time. It's a boom-bust play, a little bit. But the matchup looks great. You're going to be indoors. I'm kind of excited here. Teddy Bridgewater should be back, so I'm ready to hitch my wagon to some Robbie Anderson. Now, at number 3, we're going to Buffalo, 7,600. It's going to be Stephon Diggs, 18.5 fantasy point projection, taking on the Chargers. Bills, 5.5 point favorites with a 52.5 point game total. I love that. Chargers defense, not much to write home about. Run defense stinks. Pass defense is average. Diggs can go for north of 30 fantasy points 17% of the time. Shows up in the optimal 13% of the time. One of my favorite wide receivers. Happy to pay up for him. I think he goes as a really nice pairing with Darren Waller, since Waller's only 6K. Look, Diggs looks great. You know how big of a day Stephon Diggs can have. And that 52.5 point game total is really what I have my eye on. Love Diggs. Love two guys even more. First of which, number 2, 7,100, projected for 17.4 fantasy points. I'll take Calvin Ridley, taking on the Raiders. We know what the game total is. We know the defensive matchup. I think this one looks really good. And it's weird. Ridley is really balanced. 15% chance of going for north of 30. 15% chance of going for less than 10. Close to a 15% chance of just simply showing up in the optimal lineup. I love rostering guys from Atlanta. I never get them right, unfortunately. So caveat abound. I like Calvin Ridley. Let's just assume some random Falcons wide receiver will actually be the nuts. But 13.5% of the time, that's enough to be my number 2 wideout. Who's number 1? Really excited for this rookie, 6,300, number 1, Justin Jefferson. Taking on Carolina. They're, basically a bottom 10 defense, 52-point game total. Minnesota, slight favorites at home. All signs point to a really nice day out of Jefferson. We'll see if Adam Thielen's able to be on the field. Not entirely sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing if he's there. Probably, messes with the full-on upside of Thielen, or of Jefferson rather, but I think I would rather have him there just so Jefferson gets a little bit less eyeballs on him. We'll see where that ends up. Greater than 30 fantasy points 13% of the time, less than 10, 11% of the time, and he shows up in the optimal 14.5% of the time. That's a full percentage point higher than Calvin Ridley. That's enough to make Justin Jefferson my number 1 wide receiver. To the running backs we go, and it's kind of ugly at the bottom. Kareem Hunt at 10, James White at 9, Gio Bernard at 8, Austin Eckler, if he is able to play, would be number 7. Mike Davis on the outside looking in, coming in number 6. We are on to my top 5 running backs. Number 5 is the workhorse, 7,900, Derrick Henry, projected for 17.5 fantasy points at Indy. This is a tough matchup. 3-point dogs, but a 51.5 point game total. Difficult run defense. Indy ranking 5th this season, 6th against the pass in Football Outsiders DVOA. Derrick Henry transcends rankings, though. There's nothing to stop him from just having that pop-up show up on your phone. Oh, Derrick Henry has broken an 84-yard rushing touchdown. That's the reason you're rostering somebody like Derrick Henry. Goes for north of 30 fantasy points, 11.6% of the time. Shows up in the optimal just north of 12% of the time. And that's enough to put him in the number 5 spot. Got a couple more guys to go, though. Now we're taking a slight step up into a new tier. Number 4, 14.8% of the time in the optimal. That's Josh Jacobs. Very expensive now, $7,200, but this seems like a pretty good spot, although Atlanta run defense a little bit better than you would expect. The 54-point game total is really what you're looking for because we're expecting additional scoring. But Atlanta, 10th against the run. So something to keep an eye on if you're a little bit nervous. There are other options for you. $7,200 is a really, really big price for someone like Jacobs. 11.5% of the time, though, he's going to go for north of 30. I really like the odds of being in the optimal. I'm not too worried about the price, and I really do like the fact that, 1, the game is going to be indoors, 2, a 54-point game total means we should expect some touchdowns. Coming in at number 3, again, caveat, he might not be in the lineup, but if he is, boy, is this a great spot. $5,700 for Myles Gaskin. He gets to take on the Jets, and while the game total might not be all that huge, Miami, solid favorites. Now, the Jets' run defense is allegedly ranked 9th, 32nd against the pass, but I don't want to pass up a $5,700 price tag on Gaskin. If he's in the game, if he is finally healthy and he is able to play on Sunday, 16.8% of the time he is in the optimal lineup. You can see that's a nice little step ahead of Jacobs. It's really a price play. He should be a couple $100 more expensive in this matchup, but I think the injury has kept his price a little bit suppressed. So fingers crossed that we get to see Gaskin on Sunday because he looks like a fantastic play. Gonna need to break out the checkbook for this one, 9,500, but if anybody in the league deserves it, it's Dalvin Cook, coming in number 2, projected for 23.4 fantasy points, taking on a Carolina team that's not very good, whether that's against the run or against the pass. 52-point game total, slight favorites for Minnesota, and this one's something that we're not going to be surprised about at all. Dalvin Cook goes for north of 30 fantasy points 26.5% of the time. Dalvin Cook just goes for 30. That is, they might as well just change his nickname to Dalvin goes for 30 plus fantasy points Cook. That's just what he does. 17.6% of the time he's in the optimal lineup. It's amazing that number can get that high based on a $9,500 salary, but that's a testament to how much upside Dalvin Cook has. But it's not enough to put him in the number 1 spot, because that spot goes to the guy that broke my heart last week. Number 1, 6,300, James Robinson. This spot looks really nice. 6-point dogs, 49-point game total, so there's going to be some scoring. Jacksonville is certainly going to be throwing from behind if they need to. James Robinson going to be involved in that passing game. Cleveland is fully pedestrian. 15th against the run, 15th against the pass. We'll just call them 15th. Goes for north of 30, 11% of the time. So you're not getting him for the high ceiling. What you're looking for out of James Robinson is that like mid to high 20s game. And I think that that's because his floor is pretty high. He shows up in the optimal 20.5% of the time. You can see that's a very sizable step ahead of the Dalvin Cook, Myles Gaskin tier. I love this guy's floor. I love getting to James Robinson. I roster him a lot. I'm hoping to put the stank of last week behind him because James Robinson is my number 1 running back this week. Now, before we get to the quarterbacks, one last reminder, please, it helps me out a ton. Hit that thumbs up. You know I love it. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you know when we go live. And follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman because you don't want to miss these updates on Sunday morning because we're going to have a ton of news. Obviously, guys like Myles Gaskin, we need to know if they're going to play. So you don't want to miss the updates. Follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman. Let's move to the quarterbacks. Now, outside of the guy in the top spot, this is a pretty flat progression moving up the line, so don't worry too much about who's coming in at quarterback. Don't worry too much about their relative rankings. This stuff can wiggle pretty good, but Justin Herbert, Taysom Hill, Matt Ryan, Derek Carr, Cam Newton on the outside looking in, but now we're going to number 5. Number 5 is going to be Kyler Murray, 8,200, really big projection, 23.7 fantasy points, taking on a really dreadful New England Patriots team, 28th against the run, 31st against the pass. He goes for north of 30, 25% of the time, shows up in the optimal just 6% of the time. There's a lot of variance in quarterback projections. It's really difficult to just pin down one guy, but Kyler looks great. I don't see a scenario where he doesn't have like a really nice floor of we'll call it 23.7 fantasy points. Such a threat on the ground. That's really where you have to be worried. And the Patriots defense doesn't appear to be stopping anybody. That's a pretty big price tag. And there are a lot of options in the 5K range at quarterback this week that make it kind of difficult to pay up. The first of which comes in at 5,500. Danny Dimes, Daniel Jones taking on Cincinnati. The Giants in Cincinnati are 5.5-point favorites, which is bonkers to me. 44-point total, not a lot of scoring to be expected there, but a below average defense against the run, against the pass, can go for north of 30 fantasy points 10% of the time, shows up in the optimal 6.7% of the time. I think Daniel Jones is a fantastic way to save salary at quarterback. The problem is I think there are even better options than him. But we're going a different direction for number 3. $8,000, 24.9 fantasy point projection for Pat Mahomes at Tampa Bay. Very difficult defensive matchup, but we know the scoring is going to be there. 55.5-point game total. And a guy that can go for north of 30 fantasy points 31% of the time. He shows up in the optimal 7.8% of the time. You know what you're getting here. It's easy to grab Mahomes. He's super easy to stack up. He's super easy to find for bringbacks. Love Mahomes, but he is expensive. There's a more expensive quarterback that I like at number 1, and there's a cheapie that I like at number 2. And the cheapie is Tua, 5,900, 20.1 fantasy point projection, coming off of a nice little mild benching in the fourth quarter of last week. However, this week, he gets a date with the Jets. 7-point favorites. The 32nd ranked pass defense, that should fit him like a glove. This could be the breakout you need, the confidence booster that you need, taking on the Jets. Goes for north of 30 fantasy points 16% of the time, so not nearly as frequently as Mahomes, but he shows up in the optimal lineup 8% of the time because 5,900 is not nearly enough salary when you have a quarterback taking on the Jets. But my clear-cut number 1 option this week, 7,600, 24.3 fantasy point projection for Josh Allen. Is at home, gets the Chargers, 50-plus point game total, 5.5-point favorites, an average pass defense, a terrible run defense. You know Josh Allen likes to get a little bit of it done on the ground. Goes for north of 30 fantasy points 30% of the time. And you can see he is a clean step above Tua. 9.5% of the time he's showing up in the optimal. If I have to pick one quarterback for this week right now, it's absolutely Josh Allen. Alrighty, guys. Thank you for joining me for Week 12's main slate top 5. I really appreciate you guys checking this out. One last call for likes, so hit that thumbs up. Good luck this Sunday. I will have updates throughout the weekend. Should be a fun one. Keep your eye on the COVID test. Who knows if we drop a game or two, but again, that's why you follow me on Twitter. Good luck. Enjoy your weekend. I'm out of here.